Okay, so picture this. It's St. Patrick's Day, and the Chicago River is bright green.
Bright green.
Yeah, like boats are going down it, full of people dressed in green, and there are crowds like everywhere you look,
It's pretty amazing.
celebrating with bagpipes and Irish dancers and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
It's a huge celebration of Irish heritage, but you might be surprised to learn just how deep those Irish roots actually run here in America.
Yeah.
So today we're diving into the history of Irish immigration to the U.S.
Okay.
And trust me, we're going way beyond the typical potato famine story that you might have heard.
Okay.
So for this deep dive, we've got a fantastic source, an episode of the American History Podcast,
It's good.
featuring Kevin Kenny,
Okay.
who's a leading expert on Irish American history. And here's what makes it even cooler.
What's that?
Kevin Kenny is an actual Irish historian, so he brings like this whole other level of insight
Right.
to the table.
It's interesting how many people think Irish immigration started with the potato famine.
Yeah?
It's actually a story that goes back 300 years. There were waves of immigration, each with its own mix of economic, political, and religious reasons behind it.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that there were Irish immigrants in America long before the famine.
Exactly. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, lots of Scots-Irish immigrants who were mainly Protestant came over and settled in Pennsylvania and the southern colonies.
Oh, wow.
They were a big part of shaping the frontier.
Wait, so are you saying there was an Irish president even before JFK?
Well, you could argue that Andrew Jackson was the first Irish-American president.
Huh.
His parents were from Ulster and came to America just 2 years before he was born.
Wow.
But it's worth noting that Jackson himself saw himself more as American than Irish.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how much being Irish even meant back then.
Yeah,
It seems like national identity was still being figured out.
for sure.
But I guess these early Irish immigrants weren't exactly welcomed with open arms everywhere.
That's right. You have to remember that the colonies and later the United States were mostly Protestant. There was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling, and they often made laws to try and limit Catholic immigrants, including those from Ireland.
So let's jump ahead to the 1820s. This is when we see the first big wave of Irish immigration. What kicked that off?
This was when mass Catholic immigration from Ireland really began to speech. People were being pushed out of Ireland because of problems with land ownership and because they wanted more religious freedom.
And where did most of these immigrants end up?
A lot of them landed in Philadelphia and the areas around it.
Yeah.
They were often skilled laborers who helped build railroads and worked in the mines, which were booming back then.
So even before the famine hit, Irish immigrants were having a real impact on America.
Yeah.
But then came the potato blight,
Right.
a total disaster that changed everything for Ireland.
The potato blight was devastating. Crops failed, leading to widespread starvation, disease, and death within a decade. 1 million people in Ireland died from the famine, and another 2 million left, mostly heading to the United States. The population of the entire island was reduced by a third. It's hard to even imagine.
Yeah, those numbers are staggering.
Right.
It must have been pure desperation. But why was the potato such a big deal in Ireland in the first place?
Potatoes were easy to grow, even on small plots of land, and they were packed with nutrition. It was the perfect crop for a population that was growing fast, especially for the poorer folks.
Yeah.
But tragically, that reliance on the potato made them incredibly vulnerable when the blight hit.
So the famine wasn't just a natural disaster, right?
It-
It was happening within this bigger political struggle between Ireland and England, the Irish question, as they called it.
Right.
What was that all about?
The Irish question was this ongoing debate about Ireland's place within the British Empire. The Irish wanted more autonomy, and some even wanted full independence, but the British government was resistant to giving up control. The famine just intensified everything the British were criticized for not doing enough to help, and the Irish felt abandoned and exploited.
It sounds like a perfect storm of terrible circumstances.
It really was.
And it set off a mass exodus from Ireland. Unlike anything that had come before, what was different about this second wave of Irish immigration?
This time, it wasn't just young men looking for opportunities. Entire families were fleeing for their lives. This wave created a much more permanent foundation for Irish communities in America.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to arrive in a new country after going through something so traumatic.
It was extremely difficult. They often arrived with absolutely nothing, facing poverty, disease, and prejudice. It was a fight for survival in many ways.
And cities like New York and Boston saw a huge influx of Irish immigrants that must have changed those cities dramatically.
Absolutely. The Irish quickly became a very visible and significant part of the urban population, which unfortunately led to a backlash of anti-Irish sentiment.
Right, that's when we start seeing those "No Irish Need Apply" signs.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that kind of prejudice was so open, what was behind all that hate.
Well, there were a lot of factors. The sheer number of Irish immigrants made people anxious about competition for jobs and resources, poverty and disease, which were often associated with the Irish because of the situation they were in, added to those fears.
There's the infamous story of Typhoid Mary, a cook who spread typhoid fever without knowing it. She became a symbol, even though it was unfair of the perceived threat of Irish immigrants.
Exactly. Well, Mary Mallon, the real Typhoid Mary, was indeed a carrier of the disease. Her case was blown way out of proportion. It was used to reinforce these negative stereotypes about the Irish and this idea that they were unclean.
It's a reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can twist the truth and lead to people being scapegoated. And this anti-Irish feeling wasn't just on the streets, it even made its way into politics.
That's right. And that's where we see the rise of the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s.
Weren't they the ones who had that super exclusive oath where they said only native-born citizens and specifically non-Catholics should be allowed to hold public office?
Yes, that oath just shows how deep the prejudice against the Irish ran. The Know-Nothings were like a warning sign of how easily anti-immigrant fears can be exploited for political gain. That's familiar, right?
It definitely does. So despite facing all this discrimination, the Irish somehow found a way to persevere. It couldn't have been easy, but they started to make their mark on American society. How did they manage to do that?
One thing that's often overlooked is the sheer amount of work the Irish did in building America. They were crucial in constructing railroads, canals, and even entire cities. Their labor was in high demand.
That's true, but wasn't there also competition for those jobs, especially with other immigrant groups and African Americans? It couldn't have been easy for any of them.
You're right, competition for jobs was a constant reality. Sadly, it often pitted the most vulnerable groups against each other. The Irish who were struggling themselves sometimes ended up clashing with other marginalized groups.
Yeah.
It's a complicated and uncomfortable part of the story. It kind of makes you wonder if they were repeating the same prejudices they themselves had experienced.
It's a sad but important reminder of how these cycles of prejudice and discrimination can continue. But how did the Irish eventually overcome those challenges? How did they go from facing so much discrimination to finding their place in American society?
It was a gradual process, for sure, and there were definitely setbacks along the way. But there's this myth that the Irish stayed stuck in poverty for generations. The truth is that many Irish immigrants and their descendants actually found ways to move up in society.
So how did they manage to climb that social ladder? What were the keys to their success?
A lot of it came down to learning new skills. The second generation, those born in America, often got apprenticeships and learned trades. This allowed them to get better jobs and take care of their families.
And didn't a lot of them go into public service too? I've always heard about the Irish being firefighters and police officers.
That's right. Jobs in public service like firefighting and law enforcement offered steady work and a sense of security. The Irish became a big presence in those fields, and they really helped shape the character of urban America.
That's interesting. It's kind of ironic that the most Irish places like South Boston often saw less social mobility. Why do you think that is?
It's a fascinating question. It seems that in places where the Irish population was really concentrated, there wasn't as much pressure to assimilate and adopt mainstream American values. Those communities held on to their Irish identity very strongly. And while that strong sense of community could be a source of strength, it might have also made it harder for some to integrate into the broader society.
That makes sense. It seems like there's always this tension between holding on to your heritage and becoming part of the larger culture. But of course, there's also a darker side to the story, right? The rise of Irish gangs and organized crime in cities like New York.
Yes, that's a part of the story we can't ignore. The Five Points neighborhood in New York became notorious for its Irish gangs. They controlled a lot of the vice and crime in that area. It's a complex issue rooted in poverty, lack of opportunity, and a fierce loyalty within those tight-knit Irish communities.
And I imagine that was pretty different from the Italian mafia that came later.
Absolutely. The Irish gangs weren't as structured or hierarchical as the mafia. They were often more opportunistic and not as deeply entrenched in society as the later organized crime syndicates.
And then you have a figure like George Washington. Plunkett, the Tammany Hall boss, he really embodies that era of machine politics, doesn't he?
Plunkett, with his idea of honest graft, is this fascinating blend of ingenuity and corruption. He knew how to work the system both to benefit himself and to provide for the people he represented. It's a complicated legacy, to say the least.
It's hard to know whether to admire his cleverness or be appalled by his methods, but all of this was happening against a backdrop of ongoing labor struggles and social unrest. What about the Molly Maguires, that secret group of Irish miners who turned to violence in their fight for better working conditions? That always seemed like a particularly dark and dramatic chapter in Irish American history.
The Molly Maguires are a really tragic example of how desperate workers were back then. The conditions in the mines were incredibly dangerous and they were being exploited. They felt like they had no other choice but to use intimidation and violence to try and force change. But the consequences were devastating. 20 Molly Maguires were hanged for their alleged involvement in murders. It's a stark reminder of how brutal life could be in industrial America and the extreme lengths people felt they had to go to fight for their rights.
It's a chilling story, and it shows how even as Irish Americans were building lives and communities in America, events back in Ireland were still pulling at them and shaping their identity.
Absolutely. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, which lasted for decades and were rooted in religious and political divisions, had a huge impact on Irish America. Many felt deeply connected to what was happening back in their homeland, and they actively supported different groups involved in the conflict.
So some were advocating for peace, while others were sending money to more militant groups?
Exactly. There was a whole range of involvement reflecting just how complex the conflict was. Irish America became a battleground for different ideologies and loyalties, mirroring the divisions that were tearing Ireland apart.
And America itself played a big part in the peace process, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The Good Friday Agreement, which finally brought an end to the Troubles in 1998, was heavily influenced by American diplomacy and mediation efforts. It shows how much influence Irish America had on the world stage.
That's amazing. So here we are now with the Troubles resolved and Irish immigration at a historic low. Where does that leave Irish America today? What does it even mean to be Irish American in the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're seeing a real shift in how ethnic identity is viewed in America these days. As more people assimilate and generations pass, the connection to the old country inevitably fades.
So is that old idea of the melting pot where everyone just blends into one big American identity still relevant, or is that outdated?
It's definitely being challenged in a society that's becoming more and more diverse and globally connected. The idea of completely shedding your cultural heritage to become fully American seems less appealing and maybe even impossible.
So is there a new way to understand belonging in a diverse society, a way that allows people to hold on to their cultural identity while also feeling like they're part of a shared national identity?
That's the question we're wrestling with right now, and it goes way beyond the Irish-American experience. It's about the future of America itself and how we define what it means to be American in a world that's changing so rapidly.
It seems like we need to rethink our ideas about assimilation identity and what it truly means to belong.
Wow.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From those early Protestant settlers to the mass exodus during the famine, through the struggles of assimilation,
Right.
and even the complexities of Irish nationalism.
Yeah.
It's a pretty epic story. What parts of this Irish-American journey really stood out to you?
You know what strikes me is how this story goes so far beyond that simple potato famine narrative.
Yeah.
It really highlights the incredible resilience of the Irish people, their ability to adapt, and their contributions to American society. But we also see the prejudice they faced and all of the challenges they had to overcome.
Right.
It's a story that really resonates with the experiences of so many immigrant groups throughout American history.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that American history, IMS immigrant history, each wave of immigrants brings their own unique story,
Right.
their struggles and their contributions to the fabric of this country. Makes you think about what future generations will consider to be the defining characteristics of Irish America. What do you think? Will it be the St. Patrick's Day parades, the music, the storytelling, or will it be something deeper, something less tangible?
It's fascinating to consider, will it be those cultural touchstones that are so visible,
Mm.
or will it be something more like a spirit, a sense of community, a legacy of resilience that gets passed down through generations?
Maybe it's a mix of both. Those
Yeah.
outward expressions of heritage and the less visible but equally powerful values and traditions that shape who they are.
Right. And we have to remember that identity is always evolving.
Yeah.
Irish America, like
Right.
America itself, is constantly being shaped and reshaped by new experiences, new influences, and new generations.
That's a great point. It's not a static thing. So if anyone listening wants to explore this history even more, I highly recommend checking out some of Kevin Kinney's work, his book, The American Irish. A history is a fantastic place to start.
Definitely.
And for those who are intrigued by those Molly Maguires, well, that's a deep dive for another day, right?
Definitely, the Molly Maguires and their fight for labor rights is a story that deserves more attention. It reminds us that the fight for justice and equality is never really over. It's a struggle that continues to shape the American experience.
And as you think about the legacy of Irish immigration and its impact on America, think back to that image of the Chicago River dyed green.
Yeah.
It's not just about one day of celebration. It's a symbol of a rich and complex heritage that's woven into the very fabric of America.
It speaks to the enduring power of cultural memory, the ties that connect us to the past, and how those ties continue to shape who we are, both as individuals and as a nation.
Well said. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. You never know what amazing insights are waiting to be discovered.